Now, in this here lesson, we're going to be talking about Photoshop's suite of editing tools. Now, these are oldie but goodie tools. They've been inside the program for a long time, but it's worth revisiting them because they're actually exceptionally powerful. The older I get, the more I like these tools. I don't know what in the world that means, but it is true. And in order to experience these tools, I want you to go ahead and open up the mountainandclouds.jpg image here. It's inside the Lesson 8 folder, which is inside the Part 1 folder, which happens to be inside the Project Files folder that you copied from the DVD to your hard drive. And this is a photograph that I shot using an Olympus E1 in Rocky Mountain National Park at a place called Bear Lake. Awesome place. It's a little hike. You can do it with the kids. Really, really charming. And on this day, it was gorgeous. There was a little slim skim of snow on the surface of the lake here. And the clouds were with us, great sunlight coming through, just a gorgeous, gorgeous day. And I happened to get this pretty darn good photograph, but it could be more dramatic. I mean, you get the sense of how awesome it was, but we sure could bump it up, don't you think? For example, we could bring some of the detail out of this range of trees right here. That would be awesome. And we could darken up the sky maybe in this area and potentially, I think, bring out some saturation values. Now, these are all things that you can do with commands inside Photoshop, and we've seen, for example, the hue saturation command, how you can bring out saturation values with it, and there's other commands that we'll see in the future that you can use to bring out highlights and shadows and so on. But what we're going to focus on in this lesson is tools, ways to paint in brightness and darkness and saturation and so on and so on. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to go ahead and fill up my window here with this image. And I want you to turn your attention to the toolbox. And right here, just these two slots right here, that's all we're going to be talking about in this lesson. This slot of toning tools, as they are called, and this slot of focus tools, as they're known. Okay, so these two banks of tools, and they each have flyout menus. If you click and hold, you'll see that there's a flyout menu of 3 toning tools. O for the toning tools, by the way. And a little flyout menu here of the 3 focus tools, and R for the focus tools. I'll go ahead and press the escape key to get rid of that. All right, let's start things off with the dodge tool here. It's the default toning tool, the one that looks like a little paddle, and you get to it, as I say, by pressing the O key. And it looks like a little paddle because dodging in the old days, you'd hold this little paddle and you'd sort of wave it around in front of the film as you were exposing it. And that would lighten things. Well, that doesn't really help most of us because almost all of us don't have traditional experience. Most of us are working in the digital world exclusively. So let me just show you what it does. If I drag over the image, it lightens the image. That's all there is, folks. That's all it does. It just lightens the image as you drag over it. And believe it or not, that's an extremely useful thing. However, it tends to be more useful if the brush is a little bit bigger than this. Currently, my brush is quite small. It's only 65 pixels in diameter, which would be pretty big if I were zoomed in. Right now, I'm zoomed really far out of my image. I'm just going to press Command-Option-0 or Control-Alt-0, another way to zoom in to 100%, and you'll see how big my brush really is. This is the 65 pixel brush. But when I'm zoomed out, which is where I want to work on this image, I'm going to zoom back out here a little bit. When I'm zoomed out, it doesn't look so big, does it? And that's because the brush size is locked into the resolution of the image. It is always 65 pixels, so it grows and shrinks as I zoom in and out. In any case, I want to make the brush for realsies bigger. And to do that, I would click on this little brush icon here inside the options bar. And then I would either select from one of the predefined brushes. You can see this big list of predefined brushes. And if you want to make it bigger, check this out. You can drag it to as big as you want it to be, folks, by dragging that lower right corner size box, as it's called. And notice there's just a ton of specialty brushes. Like you could sit here and paint with a little maple leaf or whatever that is. I'm not a florist, so maybe it's oak. Oh, no, it's maple. And then there's grass and stuff like that. You can paint with that kind of jazz if you want to, but it doesn't tend to be all that useful when editing. When editing, it's more your traditional brushes, these guys here. And they can either be big or small, hard or soft. So you can go ahead and click on one of those brushes if you want to, or you can set your own brush size by dragging this master diameter. Notice you can make these monster brushes 2,500 pixels big if you want them. But I'm going to set it down to more like, I don't know, 119, that's fine. And then you can check out how big it really is by moving your cursor out. If you decide that's not big enough, make it bigger by all means. Also, you can decide whether you want a hard or soft brush by cranking this value right here. Notice this little preview here is blurry, and that's because I'm using a soft brush with a hardness value of 0%, so soft. I could have it harder if I want to. The hardness goes up to 100%, of course, and that's a pretty sharp brush. It has a little bit of what's called anti-aliasing around the edge, a little bit of softness, but just enough to make sure that your transitions are realistic. The edit tools tend to function better at low hardness values, and I tend to just crank that hardness value down to its minimum of 0%. All right, to accept the changes I've made inside the palette, I'm going to press the Return key here on the Mac or the Enter key on the PC, and then when I brush, notice that I get what I would call better effects, softer effects, more distributed effects with this tool. Okay, so that's the Dodge tool. It lightens the image. Well, what do you do if you want to darken the image? That, my friends, is the job of the Burn tool right here. So click and hold on the Dodge tool icon and then choose the Burn tool. Or, other ways to do this, go ahead and escape out of that. You can just press the O key again to switch to that tool, assuming you followed my instructions in Lesson 3 and changed your preferences, so you don't have to press the Shift key. Just press O, switches to the Burn tool. Another thing you can do is Option click on the tool slot. So notice if you Option click or Alt click on the tool slot on the PC, you switch from one tool to the next. Okay, now I have the Burn tool selected. Now note that the Burn tool looks like a little hand focusing the light. And again, that's another traditional reference, but for you and me, doesn't matter so much. What counts is that it darkens. So as you drag, you darken it. That's all there is to it, baby. Now, if you want to change the size of the brush on the fly, I showed you how you can go up here and change the size of the brush by clicking on this thingy here and playing with the doodads. All right, but you can also change the size of a brush from the keyboard. And let me show you how that works, because it is the most splendid way to change brushes. All that stuff up there is for suckers. Watch this. I'll press the right bracket key in order to increase the size of the brush incrementally. And I'll press the left bracket key in order to reduce the size of the brush incrementally. And by the way, the bracket keys are over there to the right of the P key. P is in Paul. So I'm going to increase the size of the brush a little bit. You can also change the hardness of the brush from the keyboard on the fly. And you do that by pressing Shift right bracket to make the brush harder, or Shift left bracket to make the brush softer. And now when I paint, notice that I'm painting a bigger area at a time. It's a more diffused modification. It tends to blend better with the artwork and so on. So once again, big brushes work better. And by the way, I do want to show you the difference between a hard and a soft brush. Let me just show you what a big difference that makes. I'm going to press Shift right bracket 4 times in a row in order to make the brush as hard as possible, because each press of Shift and a bracket key changes the hardness value by 25% always. And watch, if I drag with a hard brush, you can clearly see the divisions between each circle of paint. And what Photoshop does is it's really laying down individual circles of paint as you paint. And the difference is when you're painting with a blurry brush, they all blur into each other. When you're painting with a hard brush like this, they don't. And notice that they're spaced a little bit apart from each other, and that's to make sure that the brush can actually keep up with your changes, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to. So anyway, there you go. Soft brushes are better. Proof positive. And just so you can see a comparison here, I'll press Shift left bracket 4 times in a row, and then I'll paint again. And you would never know that there's little dollops of paint being laid down at all. Just looks like a continuous stream of darkness, like a little drifty cloud going by. So anyway, that's Dodge and Burn. Very easy to understand tools, but also the most useful tools of all of these. The other ones, I'll review more quickly here. There's the Sponge tool, which allows you to either increase the saturation values or decrease the saturation values. So for example, if I go ahead and choose the Sponge tool, and then I set the mode up here from desaturate to saturate, and I increase the size of the brush, and I start brushing around, notice that I get more and more saturated colors going on inside of here. And sometimes, if it's not getting as saturated as you want it to, just stop and start painting again, and you'll get sort of a new take on things each time you start brushing with the tool. It sort of starts over and increases from the previously increased saturation values. But by default, the tool is set to desaturate, and that's because the sponge tool was originally introduced to desaturate some of the modifications that are made with the burn tool. When you burn an image, when you darken an image, you tend to increase saturation values. Similarly, when you dodge an image, you reduce saturation values. However, this whole thing tends to be more noticeable when burning. You tend to really notice these increases in saturation values, and therefore you have the sponge tool to compensate when set to the desaturate mode. All right, moving right along. Over here, among the focus tools are the blur tool, the sharpen tool, and the smudge tool. Blur and sharpen are two of the worst tools in all of Photoshop. I can't believe they've never been updated. They're just really bad tools. Let me show you how bad they are. Basically, what they do is they blur and sharpen the focus of the image. So blur works reasonably enough. I've never found it terribly useful to go around blurring things with a tool to sort of paint in blurriness. Let's see how it works. We're not even going to be really able to see the difference unless I crank up the strength value here. So I'll go ahead and crank the strength up to 100%. And then I'll paint. And, you know, it's like, well, I guess things are getting a little blurrier as I paint along. Whatever. Anyway, sharpen. Let's try that out because it's a real menace. I'll go ahead and choose the sharpen tool. And I'll crank it up to 100% as well, just so that we can see how big and bad it gets. I'll increase the size of the tool here. And let's scroll down a little bit into the mountains. I'll brush across them. Ah, look, it's not sharpening the mountains, it's infecting them. It looks like Rip Taylor was here, you know, with the confetti, and anyway. Bad tool, bad tool. Yuck. Anyway, smudge tool, though, is kind of cool. Here, let's check it out. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the image some more. Ah, look at that sharpening. Yikes. But let's go ahead and smear the sharpening just so that we can see what the smudge tool does. And notice it actually moves pixels around. It moves them and blurs them together. So it's got a kind of moving, blurring action going. In little increments, you can actually, here, I'll try it over here. You can actually use it to move details around just a little bit. If you just keep your movements really, really soft, and it's not a problem if things get a little bit blurry, you can move things around just a little bit. Also, by the way, something to note about this tool. If I really crank up the size of the brush, it works very, very slowly. Okay, if you do a big drag and you're way zoomed out of the image, it takes a while to keep up with your movements. Whereas if you keep your brush size small with this particular tool, it keeps up with you a lot better. So just something to note. There's also this finger painting checkbox over here, you can barely see it on screen, that allows you to paint a little dollop of foreground color, the black in this case, as you smear. You can get to that from the keyboard, by the way. You can activate it temporarily just by option dragging or alt dragging on the PC. That'll start with a little bit of finger painting. That's what that's called. A little bit of dollop of foreground color, just in case you want it. Why you would, dunno, but it's there. All right, now we have a sense of how the tools work, but how do we get anything done with them? That is to say, how do we get anything done with the good tools, dodge and burn especially, sponge to a lesser extent, and smudge every once in a while? Good golly, never blur or sharpen. And I'm going to move my image over a little bit. Now, if you, like me, have messed up this image, you might want to go ahead and revert to the original. And I want to show you where that command is. Under the File menu, there's this command called Revert. You can go ahead and choose it, or you can press the F12 key. And I'll go ahead and choose that command. Now, something interesting about Revert, notice it didn't say to me, hey, you're about to revert the image. Do you really want to do that? Illustrator does that, by the way. It warns you when you revert. InDesign does that, and just about every other application on Earth warns you before you revert. But in Photoshop, you don't get warned because it's undoable. I can Command-Z revert, or Control-Z on the PC. So if I hit Command-Z, I'll go back to the state before I reverted the image. If I hit Command-Z again, I'll go back to the reverted version of the image. All right, so here we are, ready to paint inside this image. How do we go about fixing it? Well, I'll show you a few techniques we might want to employ here. All right, I'm going to drag down here so that we can see these rocks. And I want to dodge these rocks. I want to make them lighter. And I'm going to do that with the dodge tool. So I'm going to press the O key to get the sponge tool first, and then O again for the dodge tool. And I'm also increasing the size of my brush here so that I get a big brush. Now, in order to dodge these rocks, I'm going to do very small drag. See that? Just little itsy-bitsy things here. And you can even just click with the tool in order to create just slight lightning effects. Tends to work pretty nicely sometimes. You don't want to lighten so much that you create sort of this little bit of an aura here around these rocks. That's no good, so I'll undo that. Try to keep this down here someplace. Also, I don't recommend you drag with the tool. Notice what happens when you drag with the tool. You create over-lightening effects, and you create a lot of flare. Getting a lot of flare off these rocks right now. So I recommend, with this tool, big brushes, very soft brushes, hardness of 0%, small strokes, and even clicks every once in a while. And if you want to lessen the effect of the tool even farther, you can change the exposure value. A couple of different ways to change the exposure value. One is to just click this right pointing arrow and then drag the value down like so. And now notice that the tool is making more subtle changes when I click with it. Or you can just press a key on the keyboard. You never need to go up to the exposure value if you don't want to. I could just press, for example, the 4 key to change the exposure to 40%, or the 7 key for 70%, or 2-3 for 23%. So as long as the dodge tool is active, I can change the exposure value on the fly. There's also, notice this little airbrush item right there. And if you turn airbrush on, what happens is the tool continues to paint so long as you hold it in place. It continues to accumulate there on screen. So we're continuing to make a difference as we hold the tool in place. I don't really tend to work with that. Again, the airbrush contributes to making bigger changes to the image, and I like to keep my modifications a little more subtle than that. All right, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and take us over to the trees, because I want to show you another way that you can work with this tool. Now notice if I just start dragging over the trees, it doesn't look bad really, but they end up looking a little more frosted than I'd like to see them. And that's because I'm lightening the midtones. That is, I'm lightening the middle range of brightness values inside the image. So I'm not affecting the shadows, the darkest colors, and I'm not affecting the highlights, the lightest colors. In my case with these trees, I think I would like to affect just the highlights. So I'm going to undo that last modification. Let's set the option to highlights instead and try dragging over the trees and see how it fares. Now I like this better. We're keeping the nice, rich, dark shadows of the trees, which I think is really important to sell the fact that they're trees over there. Lends to their credibility, that is. And I can get away with dragging more than I was before. And it creates these nice highlights. Basically, the snow on the trees is popping better as I do this. Now, I might want to reduce the size of my brush at this point because I am affecting the lake a little bit too, the snow on the surface of the lake. Okay, well that ends up looking pretty nice. Again, you can do as you see fit. You are definitely going to get different results here because you're painting a little differently than me. So don't expect to see exactly the same effects I'm getting. You also have the option of lightening the shadows if you want to. This tends to be the least useful of the 3 settings where the dodge tool is concerned because it does lighten the darkest colors so that you end up losing your blacks. But in this case, if I were to drag over the trees a little bit, it ends up looking like kind of a mist coming off the lake. So you could get that effect too if you want to. We'll leave it in place and see how it ends up looking. Now, I should say also that you can change the range option from the keyboard. We've got shadows, midtones, and highlights, notice. If you press Shift Option and the first letter, you'll get that option. For example, Shift Option H for highlights. That would be Shift Alt H on the PC. Shift Option M for midtones, and Shift Option S for shadows. That's, of course, Shift Alt M and S on the PC. And it's good to get in the habit of using these options. It just gives you a lot more flexibility when you're working with these tools if you bear in mind that you've got these keyboard shortcuts that you can take advantage of and therefore work more quickly. So you can paint, try out a different setting, paint, and so on. Okay, how about the burn tool? Where might that come in handy? Well, I'm going to use the burn tool up here in the sky. I'm going to go ahead and get my burn tool, either by choosing it from the flyout menu, or, of course, by pressing the O key once again. I'm also going to reduce my exposure value. The burn tool tends to really overdo it at its default value of 50%. So I'm going to undo that little brush stroke I just applied, and I'm going to press the 2 key for 20% exposure. Again, I have the option of switching between midtones, shadows, and highlights. I'll leave it set to midtones for now. And now that I've got the tool set the way I want it, I'm going to press Tab to get rid of all the palettes, and I'm going to press the F key again to get rid of the menu bar. And a terrific thing about this full screen mode is that you can still work inside of it. So I'm going to press the right bracket key a few times to increase the size of the brush. and I'm going to paint inside this image. Now, a lot of programs, when you go into the full screen mode, it's a mode that lets you look at your image but not change your image. In Photoshop, it's still a fully functional editing mode, which is really, really awesome. And if you know your keyboard shortcuts at this point, you can take advantage of them. So for example, if I press the 8 key, I'll now have 80% exposure right there on the fly, which might actually come in kind of handy in these corners up here. And then I can press the 2 key to go back to 20% burning, 20% exposure. And I'm just doing little brush strokes, big brush strokes, whatever seems handy at the time. Look how I can draw out that far away mountain range here by burning on it. And I can probably draw it out even better if I go ahead and reduce the size of my brush. I am burning the tops of the tree slightly, so I might just sort of try to make that trim out a little bit, make it fade out a little bit by trying a few more brush strokes back there. All right, so I think that's pretty good where this tool is concerned. Now, I do have a bit of highlight going here on the lake. I'm not sure if that's a problem or not. I might go ahead and press the O key a couple of times to take myself back to the dodge tool and sort of bring out that lightning a little more just so that it doesn't look like it's a tool effect, that it's a natural effect. Something else you should bear in mind, you can switch between the dodge and burn tools. You can switch the behavior of the two tools by pressing the Option key or the Alt key on the PC. So when I have the dodge tool active, which I do right now, if I were to press the Option key and drag, I would burn, and that would be Alt dragging on the PC. And the great thing about that is you retain those same settings. So I believe I have my dodge tool set to dodge shadows. It's true, I do. And so if I Alt drag with the dodge tool, I'm burning the shadows. See that? Very nice. So you keep all your other settings in place, you just switch to burning instead of dodging. So that's enough dodging and burning for now. Actually, I think I'll burn these rocks just a little bit up front here. And you know, this tree line, it's kind of bugging me. I think I'll burn it a little bit. Oh, that's over burning. Let's try an exposure value of 1 this time. A little bigger brush. Let's try it again. See how great it is to know your keyboard shortcuts? Don't tell me it's not. It is. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to the sponge tool. Let's play with the saturation values a little bit here. Now, in the case of this particular image, I'm simply wanting to boost the saturation values. I don't want to desaturate the image, which is the default setting. I want to increase the saturation values to get really, really dramatic effects out of this image. So I'm going to press the O key a couple of times to switch to my sponge tool. And when you're working blind like this, it is easy to get confused about what the heck tool do I have selected at this point. Just go ahead and try it out. I'll go over here to a really saturated part of the image, and I'll drag inside of it, and sure enough, it's getting less saturated thanks to the sponge tool. It must be the sponge tool because it's desaturating the image. However, that's, as I say, not what I want to do. Now, remember how you can press Shift Option with S or M or H for shadow midtones and highlights? Well, same thing works here. You can press Shift Option or Shift Alt S for saturate and Shift Option or Shift Alt D for desaturate. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift Option S or Shift Alt S on the PC. Then I'm going to move up here a little bit and I'm going to start painting to increase saturation values inside this image. And I am doing small brush strokes. And if you feel like you're saturating too much, you can always press a number key, one of the lower number keys, of course, to reduce the flow of this particular tool. The default is 50%, so if you press a 4 or lower, you're going to end up reducing the flow of the brush. And I say flow because that's what it's called. I'll go ahead and press a tab key so we can see that. It's not called exposure, it's called flow, just so you know. Why is it called flow? I don't know. Short for Florence. Now, I think this is working out pretty nicely, I think. I'm going to zoom out just a little more. And I might take up these trees a little bit. It's easy to go too far with this tool. If you end up oversaturating, you can exaggerate color differences because when you're working inside of a low saturation image, neighboring pixels may actually be different hues. So you may have one pixel that's kind of greenish and a pixel right next to it that may be kind of orangish. And when you bring out those colors, you really point out those differences inside the image. So that last brush stroke I'm not so crazy about. I am going to increase the size of my brush and take the flow down to 20% by pressing the 2 key. And I'm going to keep painting, painting, painting. And this is just how these tools work. You just play with them, See if you like the effect. If you don't, go ahead and press Command-Z to undo, Control-Z on the PC, and try again. What am I talking about? Did I say don't overdo it? I'm gonna overdo it. This guy needs to be way more saturated than this. And another weird thing about this tool is the results may surprise you. For example, I'm thinking, well, I'll make this sky even bluer by dragging over it. And as I drag over it, it turns even oranger, doesn't it? That's interesting, I think. Anyway, this guy's just gotta be ripping with color. That's the way I feel about it. And if some of the neighboring colors aren't in sync with each other, well, that's their problem. Okay, there we go. Now that's saturation. And if you do go too far, and it's several steps ago, and you don't want to backstep all that way and lose all your other changes, you can just desaturate the area. You can just turn the sponge the other direction there. And I would think, you might think this as well, after all the stuff I've told you about holding the Option key and brushing, you might just reckon that Option dragging or Alt dragging over an area, like this area here, would desaturate it, would do the opposite effect, but it doesn't. It just goes ahead and continues to super saturate the image. So if you want to switch to desaturation, you have to choose the option from the options bar, or press Shift-Option-D, or Shift-Alt-D on the PC, and then drag around a little bit here, or click. I'm just sort of clicking in places too. I just want to get rid of some of these really noisy pixels that are going on in this area. All right, now I like the saturation of the image. The only tool we haven't checked out so far on a real-world basis here is the smudge tool. How might we go about using it? Well, what I want to do with the smudge tool is smear the clouds. I want to create some movement to the clouds inside the sky. And we're going to do it in a fairly unconventional manner. So what I want you to do, if you're working inside the full screen mode without your palettes like I am, go ahead and press the Tab key again to bring back your palettes. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the smudge tool here, which I can do by pressing the R key. Just bear in mind that it's in that same slot as the blur tool, so that's why it's the R key. I'm going to increase the size of my brush dramatically. So I'm pressing on the right bracket key several times until I get about a 600 pixel brush should do me. As you may recall, I told you not to use big brushes with the smudge tool. That's why what I'm about to do is unconventional. You'll see why you don't typically want to work with big brushes, but for this effect I do. Now notice that mode is set to normal. That means all colors get smeared to the same extent. What I want to do is choose lighten. So I only want to see the effects of the smudge tool if it lightens the background. That way, it'll better match this big, huge, bright spot inside the image. I'm going to leave the strength set to 50%. All the rest of this stuff is just ducky. Now I'm going to move over my image so we can see what I'm doing. I don't want you to drag with the tool because Photoshop cannot even begin to keep up with your drags at this point. In fact, what I'm about to do is going to be kind of slow. I want you to click. Just click with the tool. Nothing will happen. You haven't done anything. All you've done is you've set a starting point for the drag that you're about to do. So click right above the mountain with your tool. Then move your brush directly to the right about this distance. And then press the Shift key and click. And then just sit here and listen to me while the tool works away. And you're going to actually see this animated cloud effect in the background. Because Photoshop is struggling to keep up with your click. That's all it's struggling to keep up with at this point. The Shift click goes ahead and connects this original click point with this second click point. So it draws a brush stroke, a straight brush stroke of smudginess between those 2 points. And now let's go ahead and repeat this process up in this region of the sky. Click again, move to the right, and Shift click. So we have about 2 to 3 inches between our click and Shift click points. And there it goes again. It's animating to show me the effects of moving the clouds across the sky. Again, it's not really trying to show me anything. This is just Photoshop struggling to keep up with what I've done. And at that point, you can move around and change the location of your cursor. The program's not going to let you do anything until it completely finishes. Once it looks like it's done, click and Shift click one more time just to get a little more of that wonderful streakiness in the sky. Gives the image kind of a painterly effect, I think. Now, I must admit, it can be pretty frustrating waiting out this smudge tool with this big, huge brush and everything. So, especially since there's no way to gauge when it's done. There's no progress bar or anything like that. You just have to wait an indefinite amount of time until things seem to be done working. Well, if you want to absolutely track the progress of the smudge tool, go over here to the History palette, which you can get to by choosing the History command from the window menu. And you should see toward the bottom of the palette, you should see a bunch of smudge tool operations here. In all, I've got 6. The first one is the click point. The second one's the shift click point, then click, shift click, click, shift click. All right? So it shows you when the sponge tool gets done working. And just to create a division so that we can see a clean line between one smudge and the next, what we're about to do, I'm going to go ahead and press Command A, Command D. And that'd be Control A, Control D on the PC. You don't need to do it, but it's just so that we can see this nice distinction here, and we'll see the other smudge tool operations racked up. All right, I'm going to click at the top of the screen right here, and sure enough, we see a little smudge tool operation appear at the bottom of the history palette, and then I'm going to go to the upper right-hand corner of the image and shift-click. And the tool is going to start smearing the clouds across the top of the image, and as soon as we see another smudge tool operation hit the bottom of the history palette, that's when we'll know that this tool is finally done with the operation, and there it is. So we now have 2 smudge tool operations inside the history palette, and thus the smudging is complete. All right, that feels like I've gone a little bit too far, and I can use the history palette to back up. I'm just going to click on this smudge tool operation right there to get back to the point after the first 2 smudge tool brushstrokes. And now let's fade to the finished version of the image. This is my finished version. Your results, of course, may vary. And if you want to get a sense of how far you've come, if you want to get sort of a before and after comparison, why, here's the thing to do. Press the F12 key in order to revert to the version of the image that's saved to disk. This, of course, assumes that you haven't saved any of your changes. And then I'll go ahead and press Command Z or Control Z on a PC to get the after version. And from this point on, I can just press Command Z or Control Z to flip back and forth. So Command Z, again, shows me the original version of the image. It's a remarkable image, actually. I'm very fond of this image, but it's a little low contrast, and of course, it's most certainly low saturation. And then Command Z again for the after version, I think a little more interesting to look at by virtue of the dodge, burn, sponge, and smudge tools inside Photoshop. And why, look, folks, look who's joined us at Bear Lake. Ah, it's Nessie. Well, that has nothing to do with the lesson, but we just thought she belonged there, don't you?